Elaine Dwyer stood in her Idaho kitchen, sipping coffee from a paper cup, unaware that the DNA on its rim would unravel the secret she'd buried 22 years earlier. Her husband, Mark Dwyer, never vanished. She killed him, sealed him in a steel drum beneath their basement floor, and vanished into a new life. Now FBI analyst Keira Langley had just connected the dots, and the quiet life of Denise Hallwell was about to explode into a national true crime reckoning. The night Mark Dwyer disappeared, the rain came down hard, sheets of water that blurred the streetlights and made the highways slick with danger. He left work around 6:45 p.m., later than usual, according to the office building's security log. A few coworkers remembered seeing him rush out, jacket over one arm, briefcase in hand, as if he had somewhere to be. He wasn't the type to linger. Quiet, dependable, methodical. Mark was the kind of man who always showed up early and left on time. But that night, something changed. Surveillance footage showed him stopping at a Shell gas station 10 miles from his house. He paid in cash. No credit card use. No receipt. The timestamp read 7:22 p.m. He walked back to his car, an old blue Volvo with a dented bumper, and drove off into the dark. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. 3 days later, the car was discovered abandoned off a narrow Forest Service road on the edge of Mount Hood National Forest. It was nearly hidden under a mess of overgrown branches and wet leaves, as if nature itself had been trying to swallow the evidence. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were still dangling from the ignition. His wallet and cell phone sat untouched on the passenger seat. The engine had long gone cold. There were no signs of a struggle, no fingerprints other than his own. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned the treetops. Volunteers combed the trails, calling his name through the thick woods. Nothing. Elaine Dwyer, his wife of 16 years, reported him missing the morning after he failed to come home. She told officers they'd had a small argument that week. Nothing serious. She said he'd been distant lately, preoccupied, and she wondered aloud if maybe he'd just left. The police noted she didn't cry when she spoke. She wasn't hysterical. She was composed, too composed, some thought. But at the time, there wasn't much to go on. Elaine allowed the police to search the house. They found Mark's clothes neatly folded in the dresser, his passport still in the drawer, his shaving kit in the bathroom. There was no sign that he had packed a bag or prepared for a trip, yet there was also no evidence of foul play, no blood, no broken furniture, no unusual disturbances, just absence. A man who had vanished without a trace. Local news covered the story briefly. A segment ran on the evening news: missing engineer vanishes after work. His coworkers were baffled. His fishing buddy George Tellman said Mark had just been talking about a weekend getaway at the lake. His sister Barbara told reporters that Mark had never been the type to just walk away from anything, especially not his life. Still, with no suspects and no evidence, the case slowly slipped off the front page and into silence. Months passed. The seasons changed. Elaine sold the house and moved away. People stopped asking questions. Eventually Mark's name became just another entry in a long list of cold cases in the state of Oregon. But the mystery lingered. Even years later, detectives would admit something about the case never felt right. The car's location seemed too deliberate, the timing too convenient, and Elaine always a little too calm, a little too ready to move on. 22 years later, the truth was still buried, but it was waiting, hidden beneath concrete and silence. And all it would take to unravel the whole story was a single forgotten coffee cup. Keira Langley was the kind of person who thrived in silence. She preferred the hum of fluorescent lights in an empty office to the chatter of morning meetings. Fresh out of Quantico, she had been assigned to the FBI's Cold Case Task Force, a division known more for collecting dust than headlines. Most agents saw it as a place careers went to stall. Keira saw it differently. To her, cold cases weren't dead ends. They were puzzles waiting for someone with enough patience to solve them. One rainy evening in February 2023, she pulled an old file from the bottom shelf of a rusted cabinet in the Portland field office. It was thick and yellowed, tied loosely with a red string, the name stamped on the front in faded ink: Dwyer, Mark, missing person, 2003. She didn't know why she picked that one. Maybe it was the weight of the file, the untouched pages that seemed to beg for attention. Or maybe it was the last sentence in the summary report that caught her eye. No evidence of foul play, no credible sightings, case inactive as of 2006. Keira began reading, and almost immediately, things didn't add up. Mark Dwyer had a stable job, no criminal history, no major debt. He wasn't on any watch lists, he had no known enemies, his disappearance was clean, too clean, no mess, no chaos, just a man erased from his life in a matter of hours. She pored over every interview, every police report, every photograph, the car in the woods, the keys in the ignition, the untouched wallet, the silence that followed. She flagged a detail that had been overlooked back in 2003, a toothbrush recovered from the Dwyer's home, and logged in evidence storage. At the time, DNA analysis wasn't widely used in missing persons investigations, but now it was standard. Keira filed a request to have the toothbrush tested. A week later, the lab results came back. The DNA profile was clean and valid, but when she ran it through the National CODIS database, there were no hits, no close matches, no sign of Mark in any arrest records, morgues or hospital. That didn't sit right. People didn't just vanish without a trace, not for 20 years. Keira pulled up bank records, medical files, phone records. Nothing. It was as if Mark had walked into the forest and disappeared into thin air. But the more she read, the more something gnawed at her. The behavior of his wife Elaine, her statements were too measured, her answers too polished. In one interview she told officers that Mark had likely left on his own, that he'd been acting withdrawn, but there was no documented proof of that, no messages, no confessions to friends, just her word. And then she moved away. Keira decided to dig into Elaine Dwyer's post-2003 life. She traced a paper trail of mortgage closures, a name change, a new social security number. That caught her attention. Elaine had disappeared just like Mark, but quietly, legally, and without suspicion. She had moved to Idaho in 2004, applied for a driver's license under the name Denise Halwell, and had since built an entirely new life. The documents checked out, the records were legitimate, but the timing was suspicious. It was just a theory then, a quiet, persistent hunch, but Keira couldn't shake it. She pulled up a picture of Elaine from 2000 and placed it beside a more recent photo from a local university website in Idaho, where Denise Halwell was listed as a guest lecturer in criminal psychology. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable. The same eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, a different hairstyle and a few decades of age, couldn't disguise the truth, but it wasn't enough. Suspicion wasn't proof. Then a coincidence changed everything. 3 months later, Keira attended an FBI seminar on forensic methodology in Seattle. Among the speakers listed was Dr. Denise Halwell. Keira recognized the name immediately. She watched from a distance as the woman stepped off the podium during a break, sipping from a paper coffee cup. She left it behind as she stepped away to take a phone call, and just like that, Keira saw her chance. It was bold, maybe reckless, but the rules allowed it. Abandoned items in public spaces were fair game. Keira took the cup, carefully, quietly, and sent it to the lab. What she would find would pull the case out of the shadows, and into something darker than anyone had imagined. The coffee cup sat in a sealed evidence bag on Keira Langley's desk, inconspicuous and fragile, yet holding the weight of a decades-old mystery. She stared at it for a long time before sending it to the lab, knowing full well that this could be the turning point. The last time she had felt this level of anticipation, she was still in training. Now with this single cup, she was crossing a line most agents never dared to step near, challenging a case long thought dead. The lab technicians processed the DNA without much commentary, just another anonymous sample. But Keira watched the case number rise to the top of the queue. She checked her inbox every morning with a racing pulse. Then after 4 tense days, the email came. The DNA profile matched the sample from the toothbrush. Only it wasn't a direct match to Mark Dwyer. It was a close relative, the kind of match that usually indicated a spouse or sibling. The results pointed to the woman who had left that cup behind. Denise Halwell. That name didn't exist before Keira reread the report twice, then once more slower this time. Her hunch had been right. Denise Halwell and Elaine Dwyer were the same person. She didn't report her findings immediately, not yet. She wanted to know more first. She needed to understand who this woman had become, and why someone who'd once called herself a grieving wife would go so far to bury her identity. What she found was chilling. After relocating to a remote Idaho town under her new name, Elaine had earned a degree in psychology, but not just any branch. Her focus had been criminal behavior, forensic pathology and offender profiling. It was an uncomfortable irony. The woman at the center of a missing persons investigation had spent 2 decades studying the very systems meant to uncover people like her. She had lectured at law enforcement seminars, contributed to articles on how killers think, and even advised on cold cases. It was the perfect cover. Become part of the system, and no one would ever suspect you were hiding from it. Keira dug deeper. Elaine, now Denise, lived in a modest home outside Boise. No children, no close family. She kept to herself, never remarried. Her career was quiet, academic, not flashy, not lucrative. It was as if she had intentionally erased all traces of the life she once had. But why, if she were innocent? Why run? Why change her name, her history, her identity? Something more was buried beneath the surface, and Keira could feel it pulsing like a heartbeat under the floorboards. She began to re-examine the case through this new lens. It wasn't just about a missing man anymore. It was about a woman who had orchestrated the perfect vanishing act, and who had lived in plain sight for over 20 years, contributing to the very field designed to expose deception. Keira printed side-by-side photos from both eras. Elaine Dwyer in 2002, sharp-suited, chin raised, eyes cool and unreadable. Denise Halwell in 2025, softer, but no less calculating. The transformation was remarkable, not just in appearance but in persona. Elaine had disappeared not only physically, but psychologically. She had crafted a new version of herself, a reinvention so complete it nearly worked, but the one thing she couldn't erase was her DNA. Keira now had enough to elevate the case. With the DNA link between Elaine and the toothbrush confirmed, she submitted a formal report to the FBI's Violent Crime Unit. A new investigation was launched under complete confidentiality. Elaine was officially no longer a grieving widow. She was a suspect in a potential homicide. The coffee cup had done what 20 years of searching couldn't. It cracked open the silence. But Keira knew this was only the beginning. A woman like Elaine didn't vanish out of fear. She vanished with purpose. And if she had buried her husband, she had buried something else too. Something still hidden, something waiting to be found. The DNA results confirmed what Keira Langley had suspected, but had never dared to fully believe. Denise Halwell was without question Elaine Dwyer, the same woman who had once stood in front of police officers with dry eyes and a carefully measured voice, claiming her husband had simply vanished. The same woman who had rewritten her life with such precision that even background checks showed no crack. Now, for the first time in 22 years, that carefully constructed identity had begun to fracture. The match to Mark Dwyer's DNA was unmistakable. It wasn't a distant relative or a fluke. This was a direct, spousal-level genetic correlation. The woman who left the coffee cup at the FBI seminar had lived with Mark, shared his home, and shared his secrets. Keira now held the proof that Elaine Dwyer hadn't disappeared in grief. She had disappeared in guilt. Still, proof of identity wasn't proof of murder. Keira knew the stakes were high. They couldn't charge Elaine, now Denise, based on suspicion and a coffee cup. They needed something tangible, physical evidence, a body, a weapon, a confession, something that couldn't be explained away with legal gymnastics. But the real question was why? Why kill Mark? Why abandon everything afterward? Keira dove back into the original investigation, scouring notes, financial records and police interviews. One detail that stood out was the report of a neighbor hearing strange sounds coming from the Dwyer basement on the night Mark vanished. The report had been dismissed at the time, chalked up to a thunderstorm or perhaps a raccoon trapped beneath the floorboards. No search of the basement had been conducted beyond a superficial look. Elaine had cooperated, yes, but only enough to keep attention at bay. That oversight now loomed large. Keira submitted a request to identify the current owners of the Dwyer's old home. It had changed hands several times over the years. The current residents, a retired couple named the Harlans, had bought the property, and Keira contacted them under the guise of a property history inquiry and asked about the basement. Had they ever done renovations? Had anything unusual turned up? The response chilled her. They hadn't touched the basement much, they said. It had always had a strange smell in the far corner. They'd once hired a plumber who suspected an old chemical spill under the concrete may be left over from a previous owner, but no one had investigated it thoroughly. They'd sealed off that area with shelves and storage boxes and never thought about it again. Keira contacted the Violent Crime Unit immediately. A search warrant was obtained within 48 hours. The home was quietly secured. No media, no neighbors alerted. A forensic team descended into the basement with ground-penetrating radar. It took less than 30 minutes to find the anomaly, a rectangular void under the concrete slab, 3 feet by 6, just large enough to hold a human body. The next day, they broke through the floor. Beneath layers of soil and cement, the agents unearthed a sealed metal drum, rusted, heavy. The air inside was acrid when it was finally pried open. Wrapped in a deteriorated plastic sheet was a body skeletal but intact. A dental comparison confirmed what Keira already knew. It was Mark Dwyer. The man who had supposedly vanished into thin air had been buried all along, less than 10 feet below where he had once watched television, read the paper and kissed his wife goodnight. The perfect disappearance had been a perfect deception, and Elaine Dwyer had stayed close enough to watch it all unfold. Keira stood in the basement long after the body was removed, staring at the broken concrete. For years people had asked how Mark had disappeared without a trace. Now the answer was horrifyingly simple. He had never left. The drum was old, industrial-grade steel, the kind used for storing chemicals or oil, not for hiding a body. Its edges were rusted and sealed with layers of hardened adhesive. When agents cracked it open, the smell that escaped was enough to clear the basement. 2 forensic techs stepped outside to vomit. What remained inside was grotesque but revealing: bones wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, a tarp and old bedsheets soaked in chemical residue. Forensic anthropologists later confirmed that the preservation method, while crude, had significantly slowed decomposition. It was likely that Elaine had studied these techniques years before putting them to use. As the crime scene crew bagged and catalogued the evidence, Keira Langley watched in grim silence. This wasn't just closure for a missing person case, it was the unraveling of a murder so carefully planned, so coldly executed. It had fooled everyone for over 2 decades. But even more disturbing was the knowledge that Elaine had lived for years above that basement, walking each day over the grave of the man she had once married. The remains were sent to the lab for analysis. Mark's skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, 2 deep fractures toward the rear, consistent with being struck from behind. No defensive wounds, no broken fingers or knuckles. He had likely been attacked when he wasn't expecting it, maybe even from someone he trusted. It had been quick, efficient. The medical examiner estimated time of death between 9 and 10 p.m. on the night Mark went missing. That was just 2 hours after he was last seen at the gas station. Elaine had filed the missing person report the following morning, saying he had never come home. Now it was clear she already knew he wouldn't. Detectives turned back to the house, searching every inch of the basement, attic and garage for any remaining clue. In a locked cabinet in the garage, hidden behind old paint cans, they found what they were looking for: Mark's blood-stained shirt, rolled tightly into a plastic bag. Alongside it were several used gloves, a hammer and an opened container of DNA tests later confirmed the blood belonged to Mark. The hammer matched the injuries to his skull. It had taken years, but Elaine's secrets were finally surfacing. Meanwhile, Keira began building the timeline. Every detail mattered now. 2 weeks before Mark's disappearance, Elaine had quietly closed their joint savings account. A week after, she'd inquired about selling the house. 3 months later, she had legally changed her name. Everything was calculated. Step by step, Elaine had created her exit, ensuring that no one would question it too closely. And no one did. Until now, neighbors recalled seeing construction equipment rented shortly after Mark disappeared, though they assumed Elaine was just having basement work done. One neighbor even remembered her saying she planned to remodel, but no renovations ever occurred. It was likely the day she buried the barrel alone in the dark beneath several inches of poured concrete. The final chilling detail came from an old insurance file. Elaine had never filed a claim on Mark's life insurance. In fact, she had deliberately let it expire. Investigators initially thought it was about money, but this revealed something else. This wasn't a financially motivated murder. It wasn't about gain, it was about erasure. Elaine hadn't killed for profit. She had killed for control. She hadn't just removed Mark from her life. She had eliminated his existence, severed his presence so thoroughly that even after decades, people still questioned whether he had ever really disappeared. But now, the lie was dead. The truth was buried no longer. And somewhere in Idaho, a woman who thought she'd beaten time was about to feel it crashing down on her. Elaine Dwyer had vanished just as completely as her husband. But unlike Mark, she hadn't disappeared into the dirt, she disappeared into someone new. In 2004, she re-emerged as Denise Howell, blending into the quiet outskirts of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where no one knew her name or her past. She'd selected the location well, small enough to avoid attention, but not so isolated that her presence raised suspicion. There were no digital footprints linking her to her former life, no shared friends, no family visits, no trace of Elaine Dwyer. Keira Langley pieced it together from fragments, legal name changes, new tax filings, and the strange timing of her academic pursuit. Within 2 years of her husband's disappearance, Denise had enrolled at a local university under her new identity. She earned a degree in criminal psychology and later a master's in forensic profiling. By 2012, she had published papers on behavioral deviance and was invited to speak at criminal justice seminars. She had built a reputation as a quiet but insightful expert in the minds of violent offenders. What no one realized was that she wasn't analyzing killers. She was hiding among them. The revelation was dizzying. Elaine had not only murdered her husband and buried him under the house they shared, she had spent years studying how others like her were caught, dissecting where they failed, and building her new life around avoiding those very mistakes. She learned the psychology of detection, the blind spots of investigators, and how time was the ultimate eraser of doubt. Her disguise was more than a new name, it was an armor forged from the very science designed to unmask people like her. Keira uncovered more chilling details. Elaine had once consulted on a case involving a man who had hidden a body in a septic tank on his property. She had provided insights on decomposition rates and post-mortem concealment, speaking with authority about actions she had once taken herself. The audacity was stunning, but also telling. Elaine didn't just hide, she thrived in the aftermath. She turned her crime into knowledge, into credibility, into a career. Her new home was minimalistic, carefully curated, no personal photos, no visible mementos of a previous life. A few psychology journals, a cat she rarely spoke about. She rented, never bought. She paid in cash when she could. She never dated, never formed lasting friendships. Her neighbors described her as polite but distant. She always smiled, always waved, but no one could say they really knew her. And that was exactly how she wanted it. It was a level of discipline that astounded even seasoned investigators. Most people who commit murder eventually slip. They talk too much, they drink too heavily, they relive the moment and make mistakes. But Elaine had shown none of that. She had been meticulous from the start, which led Keira to one inescapable question. Was this her first time? Records didn't show any other missing persons directly linked to her. But Keira couldn't shake the feeling that Elaine had thought through this long before that October night, that perhaps the planning didn't start with rage or panic, but with control, long-term and deliberate. The murder wasn't a reaction, it was a solution. The FBI issued a quiet warrant for her arrest. No press, no public leak. When agents arrived at her door, she was sitting at her kitchen table with a book in her hand. She didn't run. She didn't protest. She asked only one question. How long have you known? It was a haunting moment. After years of silence, she wasn't surprised. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. Elaine Dwyer, Denise Howell, was taken into custody without resistance. A woman who had spent 2 decades teaching others how to read killers, now found herself in a room under fluorescent lights, being studied for the very thing she had helped others. The difference was, this time, she was the case. As the dust began to settle and the media slowly caught wind of the shocking arrest, public curiosity shifted toward a single burning question. Why would Elaine Dwyer, a woman with no prior record, no history of violence, and no financial desperation, murder her husband in such a calculated, ruthless way. Theories swirled in newsrooms and online forums. Some said abuse, though there was no evidence. Others claimed infidelity. But Mark Dwyer's personal life had been strikingly uneventful. He was stable, predictable, no secrets, no side affairs, just a man who went to work, paid his taxes and came home on time. For investigators, the lack of a clear motive was unsettling. The act had been so clean, so methodical, that it demanded explanation. People don't kill for nothing, but Elaine had buried her motive as deeply as she had buried Mark. Keira Langley pressed into the financial records once more, combing through the details with renewed intensity. It was then that something caught her eye. An insurance policy. Tucked among archived files was a life insurance application dated just 2 weeks before Mark vanished. It was a standard policy, unremarkable at first glance, except for one detail: Mark had recently updated it. Elaine Dwyer was listed as the sole beneficiary, the value $750,000. Stranger still, the policy had never been claimed, not after Mark disappeared, not even after he was declared legally dead in 2010. It didn't make sense. Why go through the trouble of planning a perfect murder and erasing your husband from the face of the earth, only to leave that kind of money behind? Why live modestly under an assumed identity if financial gain was the goal? Keira brought the finding to Agent Adam Crane, a seasoned profiler with over 30 years in the bureau. Crane had seen every kind of killer, those who killed for greed, for passion, for revenge. But Elaine was different. She was cold, tactical, measured. Crane sifted through her file in silence before offering a new theory. This wasn't about money, he said. It was about ownership. She didn't want to benefit from Mark's death. She wanted to be free of him entirely. Elaine hadn't killed Mark to collect anything. She had killed him to erase him. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Mark had reportedly grown more distant, according to Elaine's original statement, but nothing in his behavior supported that. His colleagues described him as cheerful. His calendar was full of future plans, repairs to the house, a fishing trip, even a note about their upcoming anniversary. He wasn't leaving, he wasn't unhappy, but Elaine was. Further investigation revealed another piece of the puzzle. In a digital archive of medical appointments, Keira found evidence of couples counseling sessions Elaine had booked, but never attended, not even once. She had created the appearance of trying, but it was just that appearance. Digging deeper into her academic work, Keira found something disturbing in one of Elaine's early graduate papers. It was a detailed analysis on the psychological profile of female offenders who killed their spouse. She wrote extensively about manipulation, preparation, and post-crime persona construction. One line stood out: the most effective concealment occurs when the killer reinvents themselves entirely, not as someone who ran, but someone who could never be suspected in the first place. It was as if Elaine had written the blueprint for her own life. By the time Keira closed the file, the theory had evolved into something far darker. Elaine had orchestrated every detail, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of a cold, clinical desire for freedom. The freedom to become someone else, someone with no attachments, no obligations, and no past. And in order to do that, Mark Dwyer had to disappear, completely. Elaine Dwyer sat motionless in the interrogation room, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression unreadable. 2 decades had passed since she buried her husband beneath their basement floor, yet she showed no trace of regret. There was no trembling voice, no tears, no pleas for sympathy, just silence, an eerie calm that unsettled even the most seasoned investigator. When the lead agent asked her if she had anything to say, she replied with a simple sentence: "It was always going to end that way." That was her confession. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute. In court, the prosecution laid out the full weight of the evidence: the DNA match from the coffee cup, the forged identity, the remains discovered in the rusted drum, the hammer marked with her fingerprints, and the unclaimed life insurance policy. A web of lies unraveled piece by piece before the jury, each thread leading back to the same inescapable truth. Elaine Dwyer had murdered her husband in cold blood, buried him under their home, and vanished into a life she had carefully constructed to keep the past buried. Her defense team attempted to argue psychological instability, citing decades of isolation and emotional trauma, but the evidence was overwhelming. Elaine had not acted out of impulse. She had acted with intention. She had studied how not to get caught. She had rehearsed her new identity with precision. She had avoided financial gain to deflect suspicion. She had embedded herself in the very world of criminology, hiding in plain sight. The jury took less than 3 hours to return a verdict. Guilt. Elaine Dwyer, also known as Denise Halwell, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. Elaine stood still, head held high, as if finally accepting the story had reached its final chapter. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't respond to the judge's final words. She simply turned and walked out of the courtroom in shackles. The media exploded in the days that followed. News anchors called it one of the most chilling domestic homicide cases in recent history. A woman who murdered her husband and vanished, only to become a trusted voice in criminal psychology, a walking contradiction, killer and consultant, cold-blooded and admired. But while the headlines focused on the horror of the crime and the audacity of the cover-up, Keira Langley kept her attention on one thing: justice. The Dwyer family, after years of unanswered questions and hollow holidays, finally had closure. Mark's sister Barbara tearfully told reporters she'd always known something was wrong, but never imagined this. She was present at the sentencing, clutching a small photograph of Mark from their childhood. "He never left us," she said. "He was always just waiting to be found." Mark Dwyer was given a proper burial weeks later. His remains were laid to rest in a quiet cemetery outside Portland, not far from the home he never truly left. The community gathered, neighbors, former co-workers, even strangers who'd followed the case. They came not just to mourn, but to acknowledge the weight of a story that had haunted the city for over 2 decades. For Keira, the case left a permanent mark. It wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about understanding the shadows people live in, the lies they tell so convincingly, even to themselves. She had reopened a file that had sat untouched for years, followed a feeling others had ignored, and brought a man's voice back from silence. As she stood at the edge of Mark's grave, Keira felt a chill, not from the cold but from the knowledge that justice isn't always quick or loud. Sometimes it waits in the dark, quiet and patient, until one mistake, a forgotten coffee cup, brings everything crashing down. And in the end, no lie stays buried forever.